Okay, so we're going to carry on with some more practical examples of this sort of concept of corrective versus contouring when it comes to dodging and burning, or local versus global, if you will. So we have this image here, and basically this is just, a simple portrait that I shot, and so we're working on this as a black and white, of course. And then sort of the end goal is that it's going to be a black and white. So that's it's an important consideration to make, I think, at the outset, because it allows you to bypass certain things that you need to worry about, perhaps, if it's a color image. And we're going to talk about those differences later in a future lesson. But for now, let's kind of look at the three variations of dodging and burning that we have here. So I've created three groupings. Essentially, one we call fixer. I call it fixer, which essentially is just our corrective dodging and burning. Then we have our contouring, and then we have hair. So hair I just leave as a separate one because, I like to be able to kind of aggressively dodge and burn certain areas of the hair, and then be able to scale that back independently of, either the correction or the actual global sort of contouring. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just enable this fixer. So we've got a couple areas, obviously, that we want to address in this particular image. And, being a portrait, we don't want to maybe have everything go absolutely perfect. This is not a beauty shot, so we don't have to, zoom in 100% and make sure everything is absolutely flawless. So my goal here is just to kind of even out some of the transitions and just, make it look a little bit more flattering. So if we enable this, we can see that that's sort of the difference. We've kind of taken away some of these darker areas around here and just made sure that everything is just flowing together a little bit more smoothly. Areas within the brows here, areas within the eyes. And so, as you can see, it's just adding that little bit of polish. And in the case of this particular image, that was a really quick process. I mean, when you're dealing with a portrait as opposed to a beauty shot, generally you don't have to spend a ton of time. If we actually look at these layers over here, so, kind of disregard the actual implementation of this because we're going to talk about the various ways that you can actually do dodging and burning in a moment. But essentially what I have here is two curves. So if we actually look at one of these curves, this is the dodge curve, and this is really the only areas that I've masked in. So basically I'm just painting white on that black mask to reveal that particular dodge curve. It essentially brightens those areas that you see in white. I do have these hue saturation adjustments clipped here. That is completely irrelevant, especially in a black and white image. It's just I have an action that creates it. So right now they're actually not doing anything. They're just, there's zero going on here, so they're not actually relevant. So don't kind of get hung up on those right now. We will again kind of touch base on those when we look at color images. And then on the burn side, again, similar, we have a couple of areas that I've burned in here. So it's, quite simple, and all in all, that probably took maybe 10 or 15 minutes to do. And then, again, just toggling that off and on one more time. So that's kind of what that's doing. And then on the contouring side, basically all we're doing is just adding a little bit more depth and dimension to the image. So you can see here, particularly around the periphery of the face, around the areas of the cheekbone, around the nose, underneath the nose, kind of, the lips, this little area in here, again, just toggle that on and off for you. You can see what that's doing. It's just really giving the image a little bit more pop, a little bit more depth. And then finally the hair, I just kind of darken down certain areas. So nothing too crazy there. And then if we combine all of that and just toggle it on and off, that's sort of the effect of the dodge and burn. And essentially that is probably, 70% of the actual retouch. I did a little bit of healing here. Let me turn that back on. There we go. So that all together, is maybe the contouring took me 5 minutes, probably 10 or 15 minutes for the actual corrective layers, and like a minute or two for the hair. So we probably spend, I don't know, maybe 20 to 25 minutes on dodging and burning in this particular image. So it's not always a daunting task. And as you kind of progress through, practicing with dodging and burning, you'll kind of spot those key areas that you need to target and come up with sort of a variation of workflows that allow you to get to, a nice looking portrait, a nice looking beauty shot, a full-length fashion image relatively quickly. It's not actually as complicated and as time-consuming as you may think. With rare cases, of course, there are things that take a little bit longer, but for the most part, pretty straightforward process. So that's kind of what we're after. We're going to be looking at those in the context of various images now. Let's go ahead and actually start looking at how we build these stacks and what is available to you in terms of, sort of underlying tools for doing the actual dodge and burn. So that's where we're going to go next. So let's go into the color image that we used before, and essentially we're just going to get rid of all of this frequency separation stuff right here. And let's go ahead and create an area where we're going to do our dodging and burning. So, you know, for my purposes, I often like to call this subject because I sometimes have a separate layer for the background. And so, you know, my dodging and burning is generally constrained to the subject that I'm working on. And basically, we're going to create just the two right now. We're going to work on contouring and the local dodging and burning. We're not actually going to do that right now. That's going to start in the next lesson. We're going to actually teach you the techniques. But let's just look at a little bit of fundamentals as far as how we set up sort of the layers that we need in order to perform the dodge and burn. So this is obviously a good candidate for actions. I do have actions for creating all these stacks, but let's just kind of start things off by talking about it, the manual process of creating it. So in here, we'll just create one called corrective or local, whatever you'd like to call it. And then within here, we're going to create two curves. So we're going to create our burn curve, and essentially our burn curve is just a darkening curve. So something like that. Now, the degree to which you actually take this down is kind of arbitrary. It's really whatever you want it to be. The difference, of course, is if I go down like this, anything that I do as far as painting in areas is going to happen a lot faster than it would if I had the curve like this, because, of course, the extent to which it's darkening is much less here than it was before. So I generally don't like to pull it too much. Something like that is probably sufficient. If you have particular areas, and we're going to talk about that in later lessons, where you're working on specific parts like maybe the lips or something, and you need to go very aggressive, at that point you can kind of crank this down a little bit more. But for kind of general skin work, that's sort of a good level to be at. So that's our burn curve. Just make sure you name it, otherwise it becomes hard to keep track of everything. I'm going to create another one here for our dodge, and then again, similar kind of amount, something like that. Okay. And of course, we should go in and invert these because we don't actually want them doing anything at the moment. So that's where we're at, and then essentially this is doing nothing right now because, of course, the masks are masked out. Now, right now these are in normal blend mode, and we'll kind of talk about what we can do as far as blending, but let's go ahead and create a second set of these for our contouring. Now, for contouring, there's a couple of options, and in fact, for any sort of dodging and burning, there's a couple of options. A lot of people like to use neutral gray layers, which I will also show you how to do. Personally, I always just use curves because I like the idea of having a mask that I can then paint black again if I decide that there's a certain area that I've gone too far on. I just paint over the mask, and that area is gone. So I just find it a little bit easier to work with. But I'll show you the 50% gray version, and ultimately both will give you pretty much the same results. So it's just a matter of preference, whatever you feel more comfortable with. Now, in the case of doing the actual contouring, we're going to just duplicate this because I'll save myself the time of recreating these layers here. It's more or less the same idea. And we're just going to call this, call it contouring in this case. So we have our contouring layer. Now, what I would like to do is to kind of have things that will handle some of our color shifts for us. So generally where you're going to have the most color shifts is in this corrective section, because of course, as we start to work on particular areas, if we're very aggressive in that area, then we will shift the respective level of saturation. So let's, for example, go in to an area here, and let's find a good candidate area here. Okay, so I'm just going to go into, we're going to just do dodging, and I'm just going to grab a brush at, let's say, 5% flow. This is much higher than you'd normally use, but what I'm trying to do is just show you what this actually does for us in terms of shifting saturation. So if we start painting here, you can see that this area becomes quite light. And actually, you know what? Let's create a black and white layer here. And again, not color balance, just black and white. Black and white is not necessarily the best thing to use because ultimately it does distort colors a little bit, and we're going to talk about some helper methods in the next lesson. But what we want to do here is essentially just lighten this area, go into our dodge, and just lighten this so it kind of blends with the rest. So let's just kind of ignore color for a second here and just sort of lighten this out. So of course, if we take off our black and white now, we can see that this area here is lighter than the other areas that we had, but the level of saturation that we had remains the same. So let's just toggle this on and off. So you can just see that we've lightened it quite dramatically, but it's certainly a lot more saturated than it really should be. And the reason for that is that when we're painting over this, ultimately the original level of saturation that we had there on the darker kind of remains, even though theoretically speaking, the curve does make a shift as well, so it tries to compensate for that shift in luminosity by adjusting saturation one way or the next, but it doesn't always do it quite the way you want it to. So, for example, let's go ahead and create a hue saturation adjustment here, and that's sort of the best way to do it. And then holding down Option or Alt, we're going to clip it to, sorry about that, let's just get rid of that, clip it to our dodge layer. So basically what that means is it's going to only affect areas that are masked in our dodge area. So that is just, if we hold down Option, that's just the area we painted in. So that's where we're going to have the effect. Now we can go in here and on a master level, just kind of slide this down. So we can see if we crank it way down, that's obviously not looking good. But what we can do is as we kind of bring it towards a different level, we can offset some of that shift. So now it's a lot more natural just by having that slight desaturation, and that kind of fixes the problem there. Now, as you can see, it's not a huge issue here, but something like, for example, when you're working on the lips, it becomes a big issue, and there's often areas I found within the cheekbones, if I want to correct them, that it becomes an issue. So, for example, if we want to work on some of these baby hairs here, if I start to aggressively dodge in some of these darker areas within the cheekbone. So if we just start painting in here to, let's grab the right layer first of all, to lighten that. And I'm not going to obviously work on all of this because we'll be here for a while. But basically what we're trying to do is reduce the contrast between the hairs and the skin between the hairs. So I'm going to just kind of dodge in the areas that are quite dark here. So it's just going to take a minute just to give you a couple of areas that you can see this effect of our saturation problem. All right, so I think that's good enough as a starting point to show you what I mean. Let's just grab this area here so we have a nice patch of it. So in toggling this on and off, you can see that we have kind of reduced that contrast. But if we go back into our color version, you can really see here just how pronounced that color issue is. Let's turn this off first of all so that we see the original. And those are sort of the areas that we worked on. You can see that the areas between the hairs are extremely saturated at this point. Now we do have areas that are undersaturated, and so those might be candidates for color shifting in the other direction. Those are not necessarily areas that we painted in, but that's just something that we may need to correct later on. But you can see these are sort of the areas that we have a saturation problem. So let's just toggle that on and off. Now if we turn back our saturation adjustment, let's just crank this way down. So that's where they are. And then as we start to go up, we need to find sort of a point at which it looks good, which it sort of blends together with everything. And that's starting to look pretty good in around that area, so minus 15. So let's just toggle that on and off. And there you can really see in these areas here how much that saturation actually shifts. And if it's subtle to you, it's one of those things that you just have to kind of practice and learn to spot. And in fact, here we could probably even go down a little bit more, maybe to something like minus 17. So that's kind of a case where we need to deal with that. When it comes to the contouring, it's kind of a different situation because generally you don't shift the saturation too much in the contouring phase, just because it's not as aggressive of a process, and generally we don't have to make a correction because everything is sort of corrected. This is just kind of adding some stylization to our image. So for that reason, I don't tend to use these hue saturation adjustments clipped to it. What I tend to do is just set these layers into luminosity blend mode. And basically what that does is, let's go ahead and actually look at what this burn layer does here. So we've got a normal blend mode right now, and we're going to toggle off the mask. So if we hold the shift key, that'll just turn it off. And let's just click on that again. And so if we crank this way down, you can see as we pull the curve down, the saturation increases quite dramatically. We've got a lot of saturation in our image now. Now, if we change the blend mode to luminosity, you can see that that saturation has gone away. And essentially what we've done is we've preserved the original color that was there, but we've completely changed the level of luminosity. So, you know, it's basically preventing us from changing the actual saturation level within those shadow areas that we're going to be burning. So let's just go ahead and undo all of that because we don't need it. There we go. Okay, so what I tend to do then is just leave those in luminosity blend mode. Now, one thing you could do is if you decided, for example, that you like your shadows to be fairly desaturated. And the idea behind this contouring, especially in the burning, is that we're going to be burning in probably some of the existing shadows that we have on our subject. So areas in the cheekbones, you know, areas down here, in the neck, underneath the nose, you know, around the nose. So those are going to be sort of shadow areas. And if you decide that, you know what, you like your shadows to be quite desaturated, you've effectively got a nice mask of all of the shadows on your subject. So if at that point you decide, you know what, I want to desaturate that, we can keep this in normal blend mode and still clip the same sort of hue saturation adjustment to this and just drag the saturation down. So it's really up to you. There's, you know, a variety of ways that you can do it. Now, if you do decide to clip the hue saturation blend mode to the actual layer, make sure that it's not in luminosity blend mode, because if it is, then it will have no effect. So if we look at this here, let's again zoom in and we toggle that on and off. So that's our area right here. Let's just zoom in on it a little bit more right there. So if I were to change this now to luminosity blend mode, you can see that it will take away that effect. So toggling that on and off, you can see right there especially that the saturation level is fixed now and it's back to kind of an incorrect level. It's not as bad as it was before when we actually you know, didn't have this at all, because this luminosity blend mode is taking care of part of that shift. But generally, you know, having normal blend mode here and adjusting it to your taste is the best thing to do. And in the context of something like this, we're going to talk about how to deal with areas like this, and, you know, whether we should do this as part of our sort of, you know, general dodging and burning, or if we should target it more specifically using a separate stack. So that's something that we're going to be looking at a little bit later. Now, when it comes to the alternative approach to that, which is basically a 50% gray layer, what we do is we just create a new layer here. I'm going to call this burn as well. And we're going to fill this. So Shift F5 will bring up the fill dialog. We're going to fill it with 50% gray. And let's create another copy of that. So Command or Control J is going to create a copy. And then we're going to call this dodge. So there's our dodge layer, and essentially this is going to be our contouring. We'll call it contouring 2. All right. So when it comes to this, obviously it's not looking great right now. We need to do something else, and what we're going to do is we're going to change the blend mode. So we're going to change it to overlay or soft light, and basically they vary simply by the extent to which they will operate on the image. So if you select overlay, it's going to be a lot more aggressive. If you select soft light, it's going to be a little bit more subtle. So it's really up to you how aggressive you want to be. For something like contouring, you can probably use overlay. If you're doing corrective, then you may want to use soft light. Now, changing both of these to overlay, and of course, like I said, you can use this technique on the corrective side of things. I generally don't recommend it because it becomes very difficult to then shift those colors that have gotten messed up. For two reasons. We have no mask, so we have nothing that we can clip a hue saturation adjustment to, because we're not using a mask here. We're essentially painting directly on that gray layer. And the other is that we don't also have the option of using something like a luminosity blend mode, because our blend mode right now is dictating that, you know, this doesn't become a visible thing. I mean, overlay and soft light essentially take anything that is a neutral gray and discard it. So anything that is going to be lighter than the neutral gray is going to lighten an area, and anything that is darker than the neutral gray is going to darken a particular area. So we need to keep within these sort of blend modes here, overlay or soft light, in order for it to actually kind of display the way we want it to. So we lose, unfortunately, both the availability of our blend modes and the availability of clipping an adjustment to it. So this is kind of the reason why I don't really like using the 50% gray layer approach. But again, you know, you're free to use whatever works best for you. And generally, once you actually have the layer set up, the technique is very similar. So whereas here we were working on the mask and essentially painting in the mask, here it's a little bit different. What we need to do is we need to either paint in white or black. So you can also use the dodge and burn tools and then paint on that, but I personally don't recommend it. I think the simple brush is just the best way to go. And so if we just toggle our black and white again and we want to lighten something, now be careful because you can actually technically dodge and burn on the same layer. I don't recommend you doing that because then there's completely, no option for you to, reduce the extent of burning or dodging, and they're all combined on one layer, and it becomes very difficult to manage. So generally, at least, keep them on separate layers. But like I said, just by having the separate layers doesn't stop you from doing both things, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So if we grab a white brush here and we start painting on burn, so let's just grab an area, let's just grab a black brush for starters. Okay, so if I do that, that's pretty intense. Let's go ahead and scale that back. So let's just go with a flow rate of 1%. So as we can see, we're kind of, burning in that area, and that's obviously way too much. But that's our burn. Now, if I were to change to white, I can paint on the same layer, and that's doing a dodge, essentially. So as you can see, there's nothing really stopping you from doing that other than you just remembering which layer to paint on. So just make sure that, unlike with the curves that only go one way, these can go both ways. So if you're going to be doing dodge, make sure you select the dodge layer. And if you're going to be doing burn, you're going to select the burn layer. So with dodging, paint in white on the dodge layer. For burning, paint in black on the burn layer. Now, again, I'm not going to cover the actual process of dodging and burning with this, but I think you get the idea. Select the layer, and in case of white, if we want to paint in a particular area, we can just start painting and, toggling that on and off. We can see that is lightening and darkening whatever we actually painted on. And if we look at that layer itself, let's just go ahead and go back to a normal blend mode. All you get here is just the original gray with some lighter areas within it, and then of course with the burn, we just get the gray with some darker areas painted on it. So that's kind of the 50% gray layer approach. For the most part, though, we're going to be sticking with this curves approach just because I find it to be the most flexible and the easiest to adjust, and it's just always a good thing to work with masks. So wrapping up our first lesson here, let's just kind of talk a little bit about where do we actually perform the dodging and burning, at what stage. And so, it's kind of an important consideration because you want to make sure that your workflow is ultimately as flexible as possible so that if you pass off your image to the client and, you decide, or he decides, or he or she decides that there is something that needs to be changed, you have the ability to go back as much as possible and make those changes. So generally speaking, what I tend to do, I do like to have my image at the least cleaned up from a healing standpoint. So I like to do my clone stamp and my healing ahead of time. So I'll create, a layer in here. We'll call it heal, and we'll work on the image with the healing brush and the dodge and burn, with the healing brush and our clone stamp to kind of get us to a fairly clean base. Because of course, there's a lot that we can do with dodge and burn, but it's certainly tools like healing brush, for example, are a lot easier with dealing with a spot of acne or whatever it may be than just sitting there and dodging and burning it and then color correcting it for 5 or 10 minutes. So if something is easy to do with healing, just do it with healing and move on. The idea with the dodge and burn is then we finish things off. And oftentimes what I'll actually do is if I'm healing something out and I find that the result is not perfect but the texture looks pretty good, I'll just kind of leave it where it is rather than try and re-heal it 20 times over, and just know that I'll come back to it with dodge and burn and just kind of polish it up. So the reason we want to do that ahead of time, we don't want to do it after our dodging and burning, is because it is sort of a rasterized layer. What ends up happening is if I try to do my healing up here above my dodging and burning, so let's just move this up and out. So if I were to do it up here, let's say I do some dodging and burning at this stage, what I'm essentially doing is I'm rasterizing over top of my adjustment layers here. And so if I change something here, let's say I start to dodge a particular area that has been also healed up here, or if I change the degree to which these actual curves are, like let's say I decide, I want a little bit more contouring, so I go back in here and I just increase the degree of my burn by kind of dragging the curve down, or I have too much burn and I reduce the opacity of that layer, then what happens is any sort of rasterized healing that I've done over here will start to no longer match. So for example, what I mean by that is, let's say we go into our burn here, and I'm just going to quickly burn some area in here. So let's burn sort of in here in the cheek. and grab something like that. Okay, and then we decide that what, let's go ahead and heal something. So we've got our burn layers here. Then we go into our healing layer, grab our healing brush, and let's figure out what we want to heal out. Let's just, I don't know, we'll grab a bunch of random areas here. So sampling, let's just heal something there. It really doesn't matter. This is probably stuff I wouldn't heal. This is all stuff that I would target with dodging and burning. But for the purposes of demonstration here for you, we'll just kind of grab a couple areas here so you can see what we're talking about. And in many ways, I'm making things worse here. But again, irrelevant. We're just demonstrating. So I've got a couple of spots here that I've healed out above my actual dodging and burning. Now let's decide, what, that contouring is just too aggressive for me. I want to take that down 50%. Well, as you can see, as I start taking this down, the rasterized content in this heal layer is now showing through because the luminosity that was healed out doesn't match the luminosity that we now have below. So we've kind of lost that ability to go back and change the extent of this. And that's kind of what we want from a non-destructive workflow. The whole reason we're using dodging and burning, well, let's say one of the reasons, is that it is non-destructive, and it's it's really nice by nature that it's non-destructive. So you generally don't want to have any sort of rasterized stuff over top of your dodging and burning for that very reason. So spend some time at the beginning just to get your dodge and burn right, and do it above your background layer, your base layer, in a separate layer, of course. And anything else that you need to do as far as rasterization, if you're, kind of grafting another piece of hair, whatever it might be, try and get that all done at the beginning. I know it's kind of tempting to want to just jump into dodge and burn and go to town on it because it's sort of the thing that makes your image look really nice. But avoid that temptation. Take the time to get your healing right and do all of your rasterized stuff before you get to the dodge and burn. And then, as far as something like grading goes, that is something that I do after the fact. So grading and color adjustments generally also follow dodge and burn. So for me, the process is, of course, raw processing in Capture One or Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, whatever you're using. Get that image into Photoshop. If you're blending multiple images, get that all done. Then create your healing layers, any sort of grafting, do that, and then work on your dodging and burning, and then do any sort of color corrections, and then finish off with color grading. And then generally that process will leave you with a fairly non-destructive workflow and sort of give you the maximum flexibility. When there's things like liquify, generally I recommend doing that at the end as well. So we can actually create a smart object out of everything and just apply our liquify to that smart object. So that's also a good thing to leave to the end. So that about wraps up our first lesson on dodging and burning, and really the goal of this lesson was to give you sort of a high-level view of where we're going and sort of the different things surrounding dodging and burning, and again, why it's important. So in the next lesson, we're actually going to look at some practical implementation of dodging and burning on sort of this local corrective side of things. So we're going to look at how do we actually do the corrective dodging and burning, and also some helpers that we can use to help visualize problem areas. So that'll be our next lesson, and then of course we're going to move on to contouring after that, and in our final lesson we're going to be looking at color considerations in the context of dodging and burning. So again, thanks for watching the first lesson, and we'll see you in lesson 2.